So how does one go about learning from the Soviet experiment with socialism? And what are some of the caveats? And how should we learn from specific policies, such as the 1965 reforms? And how should we go about learning from planning overall? From one of the papers I just showed you, the recent paper by Kontorovich of 2001, he speaks about some of the caveats and some of the issues and lessons that can be learned. And he wrote, quote, accounts of the Soviet economic mechanism, written back in 1965, around the time of the reforms, quote, eschewed the important role of arbitrary decisions. The focus was on the systematic, rule-guided behavior, planning procedures, price formulae, bonus schemes, and economic agents' self-seeking behavior around these rules. But if the ruler was unlimited, then he could do whatever he wanted. The history of Soviet-type economies is full of examples of arbitrary, ruinous schemes. He's pointing out that although it's very good and important for economists to learn about what happens when self-seeking individuals have to work around the rules put out, such as pricing formulae that the planners set up, although that's very important, it's also important to realize that the ruler had sometimes unlimited powers and could put arbitrary schemes together, and that this has to be taken into account as well as simply the response to kinds of things that we are aware of in market economies, such as price setting. One of the examples that he gives is that one of the first decisions made by the Politburo after Stalin's death was the cancellation of a whole, quote, a whole set of construction projects undertaken with forced labor. In other words, Stalin was the only one who really fancied doing these projects, and as soon as he died, the Politburo rolled them back. That was an arbitrary choice made by Stalin, the personality, and this has to be taken into account when looking at the results in planned economies. The choice of planners is important, as well as the response of the self-interested individuals to things set up by the planners, such as prices and output and so forth. Both are important to look at when considering the results in planned economies. This brings up another important point. Some will argue that the Soviet Union maybe was originally based on Marxist ideas and a Marxist workers' state, but the system degenerated. By the time Stalin came to power, or once Stalin was in power, it was no longer based on Marxist ideas, which were democratic, but was based on the arbitrary plans of a single ruler, of a single personality. But then other people will argue that the progression towards that result was inevitable, that once you put the entire means of production in the hands of the state, then all these different stages that occurred in the Soviet Union that were very different from each other would all have to be Marxist, and that this doesn't make sense. In other words, was war communism Marxist, and NEP was Marxist, and Stalin's rise to power, and the classical socialist period, the reform periods, and perestroika, all of these are Marxist? And if they are all Marxist, then what does that actually say about Marxism? Wouldn't it mean that some other outcome might have been possible? For example, weren't there periods when it looked like there might have been a more democratic outcome? All of those different stages, all of those very different periods were all based on Marx. Then there could have been something entirely different, something much more democratic, that could also be based on Marx. What about in a different country, in a more developed economy? How would it look if you implemented Marx today in the United States or Europe? Would it necessarily be Stalinist if, in fact, all those different stages in the Soviet Union were all Marxist? Couldn't there have been a much more democratic, different outcome if it was put into practice today in a more developed country? I think being able to answer that is a very important reason for studying the Soviet Union. And we can ask, if it did degenerate, as some proponents of socialist and Marxist ideas will say, into state capitalism, totalitarianism, bureaucratic waste, and so on under Stalin, was this inevitable? If it wasn't inevitable, what happened? What went wrong? Why did it degenerate? One of the arguments is Hayek's argument about the worst getting on top in a power struggle. Perhaps it was inevitable when Lenin died, if one could argue that Lenin wasn't as bad as Stalin, that when Lenin died, there would be a power struggle and the most vicious person would win, which was Stalin, of course. There are other arguments, though, such as priorities. Not only the priorities in production, such as whether to prioritize military production over consumer production, but also whether and which rights are paramount, and how those are balanced against economic rights and against other questions. For example, if the media is all in the hands of the state, does that mean that it will necessarily become just a voice box for the state? Or if the rights of free speech are made paramount, Is it possible, with some form of planning, some form of democratic or non-democratic ownership, is it possible, if you put free speech rights at the forefront, that even if the media is completely owned by the worker state, that some form of worker state and some form of democracy would allow free speech to be kept? We have to ask whether, if those rights are put paramount, the same thing will happen inevitably.